Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this gorgeous building, the Institute for Government. I hope you've all managed to get yourself a decent lunch just before Armageddon. We're stocking up if you can. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is part of an ongoing collaboration between the UK in a Changing Europe and the Institute for Government. My name is Anand Menon, and I direct the UK in a Changing Europe. And I'm glad that we've got a fantastic panel here to talk about the Foreign Office and British foreign policy. To my left, we've got Simon McDonald, who is Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office and Head of the Diplomatic Service. He's been posted all over. Postings include Jeddah, Riyadh, Washington. He was a British ambassador in Berlin and then worked, I think, in number 10 prior to taking up his current role. Left of Simon is Bronwyn Maddox, of these parts, Director of the Institute for Government, formerly Editor of Prospect, and before that, Chief Foreign Correspondent at the Times. I remember, Bronwyn, looking forward to your columns on foreign policy, and I very much miss them. However, we have Gideon to fill that hole now. Gideon is the Chief Foreign Affairs columnist at the Financial Times. I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with his regular column. I've got one story to tell about Gideon, which I remember when you were appointed, Gideon, a friend of mine said, there we go, you see, the FT appointing Eurosceptics. This is awful, which is a nice sign of how far the world has moved since you started in your current role. The way this is going to work is Simon's going to speak for about 10 minutes. Bronwyn and then Gideon are going to respond. Then we might have a brief conversation, and I'll throw it open to you for questions. So, Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm afraid I did not have lunch, but that's my tough luck. And as I look across the audience, I see some of the people whose photographs are on the wall of my outer office. So if I did not know already, it's on the record. I am doubly incentivized to behave. Sorry. So I'm going to talk about British foreign policy after Brexit. For the purposes of what I say, I assume that on the 29th of March next year, the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. The first of my four remarks is that this departure will not signal a diminution in British overseas ambition. The United Kingdom is a member of more than 80 international organisations. We are leaving two of those, the EU and Euratom, but we will remain active in the others. Indeed, because we are leaving the European Union, I expect more action in other international organisations. Because one fact that will not change is that we are a medium-sized country, and most of what we want to do on the international stage we can only achieve with partners. Second observation. We are conscious that outside the European Union, outside our biggest regional club, it is going to be more difficult to achieve what we want. So we're going to have to work harder. And not only will we work harder, but we have got some more resource now to do that. So this spring, the Treasury has given us more resource in a couple of pots, and there is prospect of some more later. So we have £30 million extra in this financial year for Brexit work, and we have £45 million for Global Britain work in this financial year and £45 million in the next financial year. And the prospect of extra might come through our Africa strategy. You may have spotted that for the last couple of years we have had a joint minister for Africa in both the Foreign Office and in DFID. One of the consequences of that is that one person has been able to look at the totality of our Africa effort, which includes more than £4 billion per year in official development assistance. Very little of that is spent on the political side, so a shift of only 1% or so would allow us to beef up what we do in Africa. This is not yet agreed, but that is our plan. Third remark is that other configurations on the international stage are going to matter more to the UK in future. So, as already said, we're in lots of clubs, but we are going to pick and choose, depending on the subject matter, which to emphasize. But I expect in the next period that the Security Council of the United Nations will be even more important for the United Kingdom, and the G7 and G20. So we will need to have different forums for different subjects. There will be quite a lot, curiously, of variable geometry, which we've heard constantly in an EU context. I think that is how we are going to approach the wider international challenge. My fourth remark is how we do overseas as a country and government. In the last few years, the number of players on the international pitch has increased in the United Kingdom. I think this began with the creation of Defy in 1997, and this was accelerated on the 13th of July 2016 when Theresa May became Prime Minister, when she created two new Departments of State in the Department for Exiting the European Union and the Department for International Trade. Looking ahead, I think this will continue, with the exception of DEXU, where I think the clue is in the department's name, and so when the task is done, I expect those resources to be redistributed around Whitehall. This is a conversation that is just beginning, but the Foreign Office will be making a claim on quite a chunk of DEXU's work, particularly with engaging other European countries. So I foresee that the division of spoils will be between several players. I foresee the recreation of a chunky secretariat in the Cabinet Office, but some will come to the FCO and some will go to the Treasury. The other players I see remaining on the pitch, but we will need a clear division of labour between DFID, DIT and the Foreign Office, and we are all going to have to work in close harmony because, as already said, the task will be more difficult when we are doing it by ourselves, so unnecessary tension or friction within our own system would just be indulgent. That's my opening pitch.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Bronwyn.
Thank you. And Simon's taken us across both the foreign policy after Brexit, as well as the narrow subject of the title, the Foreign Office after Brexit. So I'll respond on both and perhaps say some of the things that Simon can't say. It seems to me, going back, looking over the past 15 years, it has been a difficult time for the Foreign Office. It has been marginalised repeatedly by a series of prime ministers and other ministers who have wanted to either create new departments, for example, DFID, or allocate some of the things the Foreign Office once did, for example, the MOD during the Iraq and Afghan wars, or to take some of the close relationships that the Foreign Office once held close to itself, for example, with the United States and with European leaders into number 10. And we've seen a long history of prime ministers doing more and more of that themselves. And it's been, in some ways, a difficult 15 years of foreign policy. 2 wars that didn't go to plan, if I can put it that way, and then the complications of the financial crisis on top, and the strains on national finances. But the Foreign Office, as Simon has gently alluded to, and as parliamentary committees have said really very explicitly, has had a very severe pressure on funding going back some years. And I think that, combined with this dispersal of some of its role around Whitehall, has left it weakened. And I think that is very much a weakness of government, because we have lost during that some of the expertise that the Foreign Office built up over the years, and when it came to some of the European negotiations, we've seen that some of the deep experience in dealing with other European capitals was perhaps not either as much there or as much integrated into government thinking as it could have been. We've seen it in other areas as well, for example Russia, where we now are very much aware of the need for a lot of thinking and a lot of intelligence and a lot of contacts indeed with Russia and about Russia, but where that has also been under pressure for some years. So I think Simon and his colleagues have fought a delicate and difficult battle within Whitehall, and I regret that the Foreign Office has come under such pressure in that time. Where do we go from here? Clarity of roles is certainly something to ask for, but I think some of this starts with the money, and the FCO has got a little bit more. Probably is going to need more on top of that again, but again needs to be driven by what we're doing. And so let me come to the point that Simon started with. First, what is Britain's foreign policy going to be after Brexit? We haven't had an awful lot on this from the government yet. We've had obviously a great deal of wrangling about what our relations with Europe are going to be. Still unclear. I think it's something of a disappointment that Europe, particularly France, has reacted in such a chilly way to even the overtures on security. But it really hasn't left the bandwidth yet for us to get a sense of what our wider foreign policy is going to be, what kind of country we want to be. It's obviously a difficult time to play the card of close relations with the United States because the sheer unpredictability of that relationship, but that's clearly going to have to be part of it. But I think more than that, we really have to decide whether, and by we, I also mean the elected government of the day, whether we want an active role in the Middle East, whether or not that means military involvement. My sense is there is absolutely no public appetite for that. But the turmoil in that region is really at our doors in all kinds of ways. Whether we want to, how we're going to contribute intelligence on Russia and other countries to the world, what we do about development more widely. Simon's talked about Africa and the shared minister there, and we're talking at still a warm but troubled time in the whole thinking about development, what we can do to help another country develop. People's thinking about this has got less and less certain over the past decades, except that good government matters, and if you give money without that there, you may waste it all. So there is a lot of thinking to be done. I wish we could get a clearer statement from the government about how ambitious Britain wants to be, and that would help clarify the SCO's role.
Thanks. Well, then picking right up from where Bronwyn left off, it does strike me, certainly as somebody who goes, as we all do, quite a lot to Washington, that there's been a big gap between the way the British and the Americans do foreign policy. The Americans are almost addicted to this idea of rethinking things from first principles. No administration is complete without a new doctrine, a Bush doctrine, a Carter doctrine, whatever. The British don't really do that. They tend to just to sort of keep going without thinking very deeply about, do we want to rethink our whole strategy? And that was summed up for me by a minister in one of Blair's governments who said to me when he came in as a relatively junior minister in the Foreign Office, he was a bit surprised that at no point did anybody sit him down and say, well, look, this is what we're trying to achieve in the world. It was just like sort of, Minister, you're meeting Mr. X at sort of Wednesday at 2 and here's your diary, get on with it. But if there ever was a need or an opportunity to think about Britain's role in the world, well, obviously, this is the moment with us leaving the EU. However, it's both the best and the worst time to do it, because the government has come up with a slogan, Global Britain, but we really won't be able to define the global nature of Britain's role until we know the nature of the relationship with the EU, which has yet to be defined. Do we stay in the customs union or not? That obviously has huge implications for whether we can negotiate trade deals. And more broadly, how friendly or acrimonious is the relationship with the EU after Brexit? Are we kind of in a slipstream with very like-minded European partners, or are we left in quite a scratchy relationship with them? That will be kind of crucial to deciding what you then do about global Britain. But I think having said that, obviously the thinking's got to begin now. An idea that I think grows out of the very radical changes happening in the United States, which I think are almost as profound in their implications for Britain as Brexit, is that Britain has to try to, as Simon said, identify partners. And Simon also used the phrase middle-sized power. And we're obviously week to week trying to figure out what Donald Trump is doing and what it all means. But it seems to me that the US, China, Russia are all tempted to move back towards power politics where they use their sheer size, or in Russia's case, the possession of nuclear weapons and a willingness to break the rules, to break out of the rules-based order and just see whether they can muscle their way to some outcome that they want. I think that's the philosophy behind what Trump is doing on trade. That's clearly a dangerous world for the UK and for all middle-sized powers, which don't have that option open to them, which therefore need a kind of rules-based order, and will need it, in Britain's case, even more if we're relying on the World Trade Organization, just as the world trade system is being put under unprecedented pressure by the United States. So I think that means trying to identify, unfortunately there are quite a few middle-sized powers who look at the world in the same way, who are similarly democracies, quite affluent democracies that rely on a rules-based order. There are two just across the channel in the UK and France and Germany, and I think they might be able to be persuaded to work quite closely bilaterally with Britain, not simply through the EU, although that would be first call, but also Canada, Australia, possibly South Korea, Japan certainly. So you'd want initially to start with quite a small group, but I think these are countries that suddenly find in this new world that they have quite common interests in economics and security, even in things like continuing to push a human rights agenda at a time when I think the Trump administration is going to be doing much less of that. So the middle powers thing is one option to look at. Another, I think, is the Commonwealth. Now, I find myself surprised to say that, because I've been one of those people who tend to say, hey, look, forget it, it's an idea of the past. But I was struck on a recent trip to India not all Indians are interested in it, but a couple of the kind of strategic thinkers in Delhi said, there is something we could do with that because it fits with their concerns about a rising China. They see Belt and Road gradually encircling India. They see Chinese influence advancing across Central Asia and into Africa. They're looking for an alternative network to Belt and Road, which they can push back against. And here's the Commonwealth, which has a big presence in Africa, which has a presence across Southeast Asia. But I think if Britain is to really try to make that work, maybe they should do more to try and bring India on board. Maybe you could even look at moving the Commonwealth Secretariat to Delhi or splitting it, because I think that would give India a big stake in this potential new organisation. So those are the kinds of, just beginnings of the kinds of ideas that we're going to have to, I think, put on the table as we attempt to navigate our way in this new world.
So is there anything you've heard you want to come back on immediately?
A couple of things. One on the Commonwealth, yes. I think one of the most interesting things that happened at the summit in April in London was the attendance. I think the pulling power of Queen Elizabeth II had a lot to do with that, but also, as Gideon says, the Commonwealth is one of the biggest clubs that India belongs to that China does not. And so I think one reason why the Prime Minister of India came to the summit for the first time in 9 years was that they are interested for that reason. Just as a footnote on imaginative ideas of binding India in, we tried that with an Indian Secretary General before Baroness Scotland, and so well, you see the success. Second, on the medium powers, I agree with that. I think it is also true that around the world, even though we have the European Union, and in Europe we are very conscious all the time of the European Union, with many partners further afield, they still think of Europe in terms of the main European powers. So Germany, France and the United Kingdom. And so I think in many places, well, that wouldn't be a particularly shocking thought. I think we in the UK should be more open to including the EAS in that group. I think it would make it easier for France and Germany to be a bit more overt about trilateral cooperation if the EAS were also there. But that's just an idea, that is not policy.
I think if I heard you right in your initial remarks, you said Brexit will make the business of foreign policy harder. And I wonder if I could try and draw out of you in what particular ways it will.
Well, for the last 45 years, we've been a member of a big, pretty coherent regional club, and one of the three biggest players in that club, and that stops on the 29th of March next year. So I think that will certainly make everything that where the EU has led, particularly around trade, more difficult for the United Kingdom, just harder work. We will make our way by ourselves in the WTO. As Gideon and Bronwyn say, the rules-based system is even more important for us as on the other side. We will be making it our way as a country of 65 million people rather than as a block of more than 500 million. So I think maths plays a significant part.
But just, Bronwyn.
I was going to say, listening to that, one of the central questions to me is whether trade comes to dominate everything. That is, to dominate foreign policy. That is, whether because we need trade relationships, we bend everything around that, whether defence or other alliances or whatever.
But as both you and Gideon were saying, the future trading relationship with the EU is the key starting point. And right now, we don't know what that will be, and it could be quite close.
But if I were to move this beyond trade, though, just in terms of more traditional foreign policy, where are the losses that we might suffer from Brexit?
I think every place where you're used to being part of regional engagement with a third country, we're just by ourselves. But, as already said, a lot of the world never really looked at the United Kingdom in foreign policy terms principally as part of the European Union. So I spent a lot of my career in the Middle East, and they dealt with the UK as the UK. And dealt with other European countries principally bilaterally. The Brussels institutions did not feature large in our relations either with Saudi Arabia or with Israel, with the two countries where I served. So it's not, I think, an impossible task, but I absolutely agree that we have to make some choices. That when you're part of a bigger club with bigger resources, you can spread yourself more plausibly across the whole world. We will have to prioritise. We talk a lot about prioritisation. I think EU exit confronts us with an unavoidable task.
Did you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think that's is one of the problems with the global Britain vision, because there is a resource question which wasn't necessarily addressed by the Brexiters, who have this idea that we can now go out into the world, but actually we're probably going to have to do a lot more diplomacy within the EU itself, because we're going to have a whole bunch of bilateral relationships to tend to, and we're also going to be trying to build up relationships with, basically everyone, except we can't, because we'll have to pick and choose for reasons that Simon lays out.
But I need to endorse what Gideon's just said about starting in Europe. Especially in this century, we've been doing more and more through Brussels. So across the European Union, where we have embassies in all member states, they are, with the exception of France and Germany, smaller than they used to be. And most of them have more junior ambassadors than they used to have. And so one reason we've got some Brexit, money-labeled Brexit, is that we need to beef up what we are doing in Sweden and the rest of the European Union.
I completely agree with that, I must say. As I said at the beginning, I think it has been a loss and a kind of atrophy of that. And I'd be surprised if the money that you've been given is enough to achieve what you've described, but we can come back to that. But I was struck by your point on the Middle East, because there I think you really do have a point that if you think of the countries we've dealt with, not just Israel and Saudi Arabia, but in different ways the Iran deal and the Iraq invasion as well, we weren't dealing with them as part of the EU. Iran a bit, but it was as part of the six.
Yeah.
So,
On global Britain, as a diplomat, does this feel substantively new to you? Or is it just a case of old wine in new bottles? Is it just another label for keeping on doing the same things before with a new logo?
I think there clearly have been shortcomings with the label because other people are in charge of interpretation. And the two widest interpretations, I think, are A, that global Britain was code for turning our back on Europe. Or B, that global Britain was code for Empire 2.0. So neither of these is true. I don't think either of them was ever in the head of the Foreign Secretary as he coined the phrase, but that's how it was taken out there. I think for us, global Britain is about being present, engaged and effective around the whole world. Within that, we have to make choices. Although we have a network of 274 posts and we are going to expand that, a lot of it is very, very small. That I have nearly half my posts that have 1 or 0 UK-based members of staff. So, you know, presence can be presence and not much else. But we've learned that if you are not present, you lose your eyes and ears and any chance of influence. And we saw some of that with the ICJ vote last year. That some places thought we'd lost interest and so departed company.
Do either of you want to come back on global Britain before I...
Well, it's not bad as these slogans go, but it clearly is a slogan saying that we're here to talk to your trade department. It's better than we are a medium-sized power, which is not one of the great rallying cries of history, I think. I mean, it depends what we make of it. Down the years, I think it's usefully vacuous as it is.
But I wonder whether, I mean, one aspect that we haven't really discussed is the extent to which Britain is actually more vulnerable outside the EU. And you look at the intensification of the deterioration in the relationship with Russia, and actually that was kind of encouraging how the EU rallied round, but I'm sure the Russians will be back and will try to sort of pick apart that unity. There'll be other tests whether the European Union will necessarily always do that, particularly given the changes that you now see in Italy. Austria's another country, Putin's there, I think, tomorrow. So that European Union toughness towards Russia might not survive for very long, and I think that we could be looking at quite a long-term deterioration in the British-Russian relationship.
It's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, think back,
At least since
even a decade.
Oh, sure, but it's going to be
MVP,
but it's going to be different outside the EU. Is what I'm saying. I mean, it's harder to we did it this time, but I think it's harder to assume that you'll get the EU solidarity.
I see that point, but I point out that the reaction after Salisbury was a global reaction.
Yeah.
So although, of course, the EU was the core of that, it wasn't the whole of that, and even within the EU there was differentiation.
It was encouraging. I just think we can't assume it's always going to be like that. I mean, I think that another potential vulnerability is the UN Security Council seat. Fortunately, it's even harder to agree on UN reform than on EU reform. So that kind of inertia may prevent that seat being picked off. But I think that certainly you hear more discussion of it now.
I think that is a good example of what we might lose. The Russian one, to me, the European reactions Russia's been doing a good job for 10 years of trying to splinter different bits of European opinion against each other, and there are different.
Oh, sure, but I just think that we're now in a phase where actually Britain's relations with Russia are sort of dramatically worse than they've been for some time.
Well, one thing on Russia and one thing on the UN. On Russia, as Bronwyn says, this has been going on a long time. That at least since 2006-07, with the killing of Litvinenko and the presentation of the file against Lugovoy, we've had a scratchy relationship. And all the measures that Gordon Brown in his first month as Prime Minister put in place against Russia remain in place because the relationship has not had an uptick since, and now it's gone worse, as you say. But it's not just the UK. I think one reason why there was such general reaction was that other countries took this chance to look at what was happening to them, courtesy of Moscow. And Russia has been up to its agenda across the world. And so it was a chance for all countries to say enough. And on the UN, I think, the Charter protects us. It's very difficult to change the rules. I can see no chance that the UK changing its relationship with the continent will provoke a general reform of the United Nations. So I don't take that particularly seriously. But the key point for us is that we continue to fulfill the obligations of a permanent member of the Security Council. So we always send our very best diplomats to New York, and the UK tries to play a constructive role, moving dossier along, including things that don't get a huge amount of publicity in the UK or even around the international community. Most of the Security Council's agenda is in Africa, and we're doing our bit.
Okay, I'm going to throw it open for questions and comments now. Can I just ask you, 1, to introduce yourself, 2, to be brief, and 3, to bear in mind that Simon is a civil servant and not a politician, lest you be tempted to think otherwise. Yeah, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Norman Strauss. I find the kaleidoscopic view and the sort of touching upon what in business be strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, absolutely the starting point. And I see clearly that the diplomatic service has to maintain diplomatic relationships. What I don't understand is where the guiding strategy and purpose that directs focus, prioritization, and above all, not just counterpunching in the relationships and committees that one goes to, but actually generating an original strategic purpose which might actually get people wanting to talk to the UK again.
Should we take them one at a time for the moment and see how we go?
I don't know whether Simon's role, as you pointed out, as a civil servant makes that hard to answer, but I think a lot of it comes from the projection of your political leader. I think one of the reasons there's a lot of interest in France at the moment is that Macron is quite a dynamic guy who's very charismatic and who has the confidence to go around saying this is what France thinks and clearly believing that it matters and that people should listen, and that in a sense creates something. Of course he could have a few major setbacks and some of the gloss could come off him, but at the moment I think Britain's political leadership is so inward focused and so wrapped up in Brexit that they're not yet in a position to project that kind of confidence and outward looking nature. Maybe that will happen in a post-Brexit era.
Do you want to?
I think what British governments throughout history have tried to do is pretty consistent. To protect our citizens, to promote our prosperity, to project our influence. And different governments put the emphasis in different places over the years. And as Gideon says, it's up for grabs next year.
I think once the government manages to lift its head from Brexit, it will find the bigger words to put to this, which aren't hard, that it's a good country to do alliances with, a great place to live and work, and so on. But Brexit is so consuming at the moment of energies and attentions that you can feel that it's sort of shrinking people's vocabulary.
Thank you. Carol Walker. You talked about the fact that foreign policy will be more difficult after Brexit. I wonder whether you would accept that there are many other countries outside the EU who see Britain very much, or deal with Britain very much, as one of those three major powers in the EU, and that thus they will see us as less important after Brexit. And if I may also, I wonder how concerned you are that the whole process of Brexit in itself, which, as Bronwyn was saying, is absorbing so much focus at the moment, which is looking, how should we say, a bit messy, whether that process may in itself damage Britain's global standing.
I don't feel tempted, Carol, to comment on the second. But on the first, I think that, as already said, so I'm repeating myself, we remain one of the three big European powers, whether we're in the European Union or out of the European Union. That travelling in Africa, in East Asia, in Latin America, that is how we have been treated even during our membership. So I think that in many parts of the world that the wiring diagram won't be fundamentally significant.
Everyone on that row wants to ask a question, so what I suggest is we take the two gentlemen on that row together, and it gives you time to prepare for David Hannay's question afterwards.
Thank you very much. I'll just make a couple of points very briefly. My name is Bob Seeley. I'm the newish Member of Parliament for the Isle of Wight, and I sit on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I just want to nail a couple. By the way, if we're interested in Russian warfare, I've actually just published through the Henry Jackson Society a definition of Russian warfare. It's out today, and we have a meeting in Parliament at 6 o'clock, so everyone's welcome. Can I just ask two questions? Firstly to Sir Simon, and then secondly to Gideon. Sir Simon, I just get so wound up when I hear this medium-sized power stuff. I'm not pretending for 1 second that Britain is some great power still and all this sort of monarchy. We are not a superpower. China and America are the superpowers. Below that, there are a series of great powers. And if you define power, and you call Russia a great power purely because of its nuclear destructive power, that is missing a trick in the modern world, because we are in many ways the second most powerful nation on earth in terms of our soft power. So can we please nail this sort of we're a little country routine? I don't think it's going to help us post-Brexit. Secondly, thoughts please on that. Secondly, to Gideon, theory and the basis of theory, and now is a good time to think about what our nation stands for. And please don't all laugh, but because you haven't got time to write what global Britain is, I'm thinking of saying to Boris, let me write our foreign policy manifesto for the next couple of years. So I'm very keen to do this work. Should we be going back to basics? Should we be thinking, are we a Hamiltonian state, a Jacksonian state, and looking, for example, at the sort of US foreign policy theory and going back to these fundamental beliefs, and what would you say they are? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ben Glaze from the Daily Mirror. So Simon, you mentioned the problems with the messaging around global Britain. I'm just wondering what you think the real consequences of that have been, both with non-EU countries and EU countries.
Okay, Mr. Seeley, I don't think medium-sized is small. I mean, we are looking at the league table in the top half dozen for the size of the economy, the size of our armed forces, our aid development assistance is in the top 3. So we are of weight and consequence, but the top 2 are way ahead. So it's that relative thing that I think we need to be honest about, because the United States and China are way ahead of everybody else. And on the Great Britain label, I found more consequence within the United Kingdom than around the world. Because around the world, I found people asking questions rather than making presumptions.
Look, I mean, I think there's a fine line between confidence and overclaiming. I'm all for being confident and being aware of the qualities of this country and the things it has to offer. I think, however, if you travel around the world, as I do, I'm sure you do, I think that there is a general perception now that we're going to have to try to reverse, that Britain has just shot itself in the foot. And I think that if we wander around proclaiming what a great power we are, there's a danger that we'll be greeted with a smirk rather than kind of recognition. So I think you've got to be a bit careful. I think that there is a lot of respect for Britain, varies obviously in different places, and an awareness of what it has to offer. But I think there is also a sense that maybe this Brexit vote is a sign of delusions of grandeur, frankly. And I think we need to combat that. And if we just go around saying, we're back, guys, aren't we marvellous? I don't think it's necessarily going to be helpful, actually. On the, how does one rethink foreign policy? I think, everybody I think, what you want to do is very worthwhile and necessary. I mean, I guess if I were doing it, you'd have to start with trying to define national interests, because that's a phrase that's used a lot, but I'm not sure we always know what we mean by it. Are we talking about security? I think a lot of people internally would think more about things in terms of prosperity, their personal security in terms of like healthcare and pensions, rather than the more traditional visions of national security. How do you balance those kinds of things? So I think you've got to start with really quite a focused discussion of, well, what are we trying to do for the people of this country, and then build out from there.
So let me say something on the first question, which was about how the world will see us. I think we did suffer a drop in reputation on the Brexit vote. People in other countries thinking, why on earth would they do that? We won't suffer a permanent one. I mean, the expectation at many countries, it seems to me, to the extent they're paying attention at all, is to think that we'll manage a fudge, and only if we lose a government, end up with no deal, or end up with a much significantly worse economy, will we have suffered a permanent drop in reputation in their eyes. Otherwise, they assume that we and the EU will somehow get some kind of fudge through, whether or not that is realistic. On what we should aim for, I think the world, though, will be looking a lot at one thing and taking that as a proxy for our foreign policy, and that's our immigration policy that we end up with after Brexit.
Thank you. David, we wait for them.
David Haney, I'm a member of the International Relations Committee of the House of Lords, which, funnily enough, is looking at this issue too and conducting an inquiry on it now. But just one point about the UN. I agree with Simon totally, but I think what we need to reflect on is that for 20 years after the UN was established, nationalist China was a permanent member of the Security Council. I would defy anyone in this room to say anything they did during that period that had any effect on what the Security Council did. So I think that might be a better focus than whether we're likely to lose our seat. But two questions, if I could. The first one, I was a bit startled when you said we're not reducing our ambition. Some people might say that our ambition has exceeded our capacity to deliver it by quite a long way for quite a long time. And to simply ignore the fact that the two props of British foreign policy, the relationship with Europe and the relationship with Washington, have been startlingly changed, is probably not the best place to start. But perhaps you could comment on that. I know how difficult it is to say we are actually reducing our ambition, but that it is important. And the second is a rather technical question. It looks to me from the outside as if we are siloizing our foreign policy quite steadily. The idea of appointing trade commissioners all over the world, answerable apparently to a government department called the Department for International Trade, it already exists with the international development, and dual hatting is not a durable solution to that. It's a short-term fix to it, but it's not a durable solution to it. And then there is the Ministry of Defence. Now, I just wonder, who are all your ambassadors, our ambassadors, going to be receiving their instructions from? If there's a conflict between doing a trade deal with country A and the way they're treating their citizens in terms of human rights, or the way they're behaving in terms of the rules-based international order, who is going to be issuing those instructions? And what is the role of the ambassador going to be when there's a trade commissioner who apparently answers to some completely different minister, but who comes in and out of their country without having to say by your leave?
Well, I try to emphasize that harmony is important, and in the harmonious relationship there is also a need for leadership. And so around the world, the head of mission, the ambassador or the high commissioner, I believe, is the person who has the relationship in her or his hands, and all the other government players need to tie into that person. And as a theoretical model, I think it can and should work. but it means that with our new trade commissioners, they tie into the ambassador or high commissioner in the particular territory they are working. I also think that the real life will help this, because we've invented trade commissioners, but these are not known to other governments. So when there is a particularly difficult thing with the UK government, I believe their default setting is still going to be, well, get the ambassador in. And so, you know, the way other people react is part of this. So if it is understood that ambassadors and high commissioners are providing the overall leadership, and when for the really difficult strategic stuff the other side is still prioritizing the ambassador, then I think it can work.
Do either of you two want to?
I think there's pressure, as I said, for trade to become the dominant part of any relationship, and for other things like aid and other wrinkles to be bent round that.
Right, so we've got Tim here in the red jumper, we've got a gentleman here at the front, a gentleman back there, two gentlemen in that section. You see the theme here. If there are any non-gentlemen, want to ask a question, do go ahead.
Sorry, I'm a gentleman. Tim Bale from Queen Mary University of London. I take Simon's point about the generally bipartisan nature of British foreign policy over the last few decades, but we now have an extremely polarised government versus opposition in this country. So perhaps leaving Sir Simon out of it, because I understand his problems as a civil servant with answering a question like this, if I were to cheekily add 3 words onto the end of this and say, under Jeremy Corbyn, would Bronwyn and Gideon give a slightly different answer to the question?
It's interesting because they're not as much polarised between between themselves as they are within their parties. And one of the curiosities of this is that we don't have a leader of the opposition arguing something at this point very, very different from what the government, to the extent we can discern what the government is saying, very, very, very different on that. On Brexit, yeah. On foreign policy, more generally. Yes, but there's wrinkles there. And again, it's very hard to get something explicit at this point from Labour about relations with the US, about military action, about Russia. These are tones, and then great drama attached to the interpretations of those tones.
I don't know.
Gideon,
all I'd say is I would pay money to be the fly on the wall at the first Jeremy Corbyn-Donald Trump meeting. It would be fairly extraordinary. But I mean, I think to some extent, Corbyn's traditional anti-Americanism would be a much easier fit with the times than it would have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So that in a sense, Trump is a bit like the sort of cartoon, swaggering American president that Corbyn has always been kind of projecting onto the White House. But I don't think, so in that sense, I think he'd oddly feel relatively comfortable with that world in the sense that it fits his worldview. However, he'll have to start thinking about things he hasn't thought about much, like national security, and how does he then adapt to that? Some of those questions, unless he's truly even more radical than we think, he'll have to start addressing, and to that extent, obviously, the current direction of the US government of Russia are problematic. I mean, obviously, Corbyn and even more Seamus Milne have traditionally been very sympathetic, or more sympathetic than is usual towards Russia. Whether they'd be able to, so I guess he would attempt to rebuild relations with the Russians, distance himself from the US. What he'd do about NATO would be secondary to what America is doing about NATO, but he'd, again, would be more comfortable than most previous British Prime Ministers with the idea of a NATO that was changing pretty radically. But I suspect he'd be kind of poorly cut out for this new world of power politics and great man politics. That's not the way he thinks. I mean, I think he thinks in terms of sort of international solidarity and, reaching out to the Latin American left. Now, they may be in for a revival, so, I guess he could rebuild relations with a new Mexican government.
I think the bite of your question, though, is really on the economics, which we're not discussing here. But if a Corbyn government wanted to do something about state aids or about renationalisation, all that kind of thing, that having a knock-on effect on the trade relationships would be sort of where I'd look for it.
Mark Boliat from City of London. I want to follow up a point Sir Simon made about our diplomatic work within the European Union post-Brexit. Businesses are already rapidly building up their representational capacity throughout the European Union, including in Brussels, and it seems to me we're going to be in a pretty permanent state of negotiation with the EU, as Switzerland is, which always has the capacity for more tension. Just some thoughts on just what are we going to need dealing with the EU itself over the next few years, and what are the implications for that, bearing in mind most of these issues will be on trade and on business issues.
Our mission or representation to the EU has traditionally been one of our biggest in the world and is led by one of only 2 ambassadors of permanent secretary rank. These things will continue after the 29th of March next year for the reasons you say. So it is already clear that we'll have an SMS4 ambassador in the mission. It will probably get a new name to mark the change, but it will remain one of our biggest and most important missions anywhere in the world.
But no specific department? No specific domestic department to handle?
No, the Foreign Office.
Okay.
The Foreign. Tim Barrow's appointment is one I'm particularly pleased with.
Yeah. No, I mean, it reminds me of, I think it was about 18 months before the referendum, a late night listening to the radio, and there was Boris Johnson on the radio before he'd come out for one side or the other, and he was thinking aloud and said, of course, if we actually leave the European Union, we're actually going to have double the size of UKREP. We're not going to, we'll need even more representation to Europe. Well, not something he said much in the campaign, but I think he's kind of, he must, well, clearly it's aware of it.
I think government, as we're about to point out in a report on Is Whitehall Ready, question mark, and provide your answer, which is out very soon. I think it could do with a lot more consultation with business and on some of these details of the implications that are coming. No, I'm storing up a question for Simon, but we can...
Paul Adamson of eShop Magazine. My question very much builds on Mark's question, Sir Simon. Beyond beefing up the representation in Brussels and maybe rebranding it, renaming it, could you give us some idea of how you actually will engage more with the U27 in practical terms? It's one thing to have more civil servants on the ground in a brand new embassy, but how will you actually go about trying to influence policy on the ground once we've left the European Union next year? And secondly, since we're all in this together, whether it's business like Mark's bailiwick and other parts of UK PLC, but also civil society, given that we're all in this new world together, do you see any scope for at least exchange of best practice between government and Whitehall on one hand and the private sector and civil society on the other? Thank you.
Ever since the vote, we've been increasing the heft of our missions in Europe, and there are 2 things that, or 3 things I can do. One is that the ambassador can be a more senior figure, and as we voted, a quarter of our ambassadors to the European Union countries were not in the senior management structure, so relatively junior figures. That would change very quickly, so they are now all in the senior management structure, and quite a lot of the grading of the jobs it will rise, I predict, in the next few months. Second, we can make them bigger. So all our embassies in the EU have had some extra UK-based staff in the last 2 years, and we'll get more. And third, we can give them more programme money to spend. And we are in the process of doing that. One thing that we have to change quite quickly is to bring in the scholarship programme that we run around the world, which I think we run very successfully around the world, Chevening, which has grown a lot in the last few years, but does not include the countries of the European Union. So that we have to change, and I think we will change that. So there'll be more clout.
And working with business and civil
society? Yeah, we do, and we're always trying to do that. But One of a particular thing we're looking at is having more secondments both ways. So more people from the diplomatic service out in business, and people from the private sector in diplomatic jobs. I think head of mission is an unusual entry grade for somebody coming from outside, but there are plenty of jobs besides head of mission.
Do you know, one of the things that people point out as being unique about the EU is the way that interstate relations become somehow domesticated. So, you know, our relations with France and Germany become a matter of domestic policy rather than foreign policy. Will there be an effort to maintain that post-Brexit? That is to say, have a greater density of contacts between sectoral ministries than is normal, perhaps, in international relations?
I think that will be a feature of the successor to UKREP, because yes, I mean, the policy developed in Brussels will affect domestic ministries as least as much as the Foreign Office.
But do you see that in our bilaterals as well with the individual member states?
It already happens. It already happens.
Do either of you two want to?
The question, it is relevant. I was kind of mulling over as Simon was talking, goes right back to your point that the relationship could be close. Are you surprised by the hard line that the EU has taken on security and on participation in things like Galileo, which isn't pointing towards
frankly, yes. Because I do not see it is actually in the continent's strategic interest to be quite that adamantine. But this is still in the middle of a negotiation, so this is not necessarily where we end up.
Yeah, I mean, my worry is that we might, I'm sure it wasn't Simon's call, but we might have slightly misplayed our hand at a certain point by saying, of course, security cooperation will continue, etc. Because I think the French just said, great. And therefore we don't have to give you anything as part of a quid pro quo. So there's a kind of French version of cake and eat it, which is, well, we know that you're going to continue with our close security cooperation, so we can therefore be very tough on everything else.
Because they gave the Prime Minister such a hard time, and she said in the beginning it was exactly. A bargaining chip, and then she had to row back.
Yeah, it was a mess. Yeah.
This gentleman just behind.
I'm James Kidner from Improbable, a technology startup, but diplomat on secondment there, so you're making the journey that you're encouraging us to do, Simon. Can we talk a little bit about what I would call the human aspect of all this? I can well remember the Foreign Office in late June 2016, traumatized, post-traumatic stress. Most people in that institution had worked hard for the European Union, with the European Union for most of their career, and suddenly this vision of a place in the world was fundamentally transformed. How long, and I pay tribute to you, Sir Simon, for, dare I say it, holding morale as you did in those difficult times. But how much has it changed now, and how difficult is it for those people who've worked for that institution for many years to see the opportunity that attaches to differentiating, dare I say it, against an institution that's been part of our life for 45 years? Where, in particular, in the values of the United Kingdom, is there a difference between where we stand in the world and where the EU stands? And how difficult is it going to be to make anything of this?
If I live to be 100 years old, I will never forget the 24th of June 2016, when it was the best attended all-staff meeting ever, and we had 1,100 telephone lines open around the world. It was a dramatic atmosphere, but we are civil servants. We work for the government of the day, and we are proud to do that, and we try to defend and promote British interests as best we can. And the importance and intellectual stimulation of that task, I do not think are in doubt. And I think that is what keeps people motivated and keeps people going. As for values, I do not think we are separating from European values. We remain committed to the rules-based system, to democracy, to human rights, to the equalities and liberties that define all European countries, and I expect us to continue to work closely with our neighbours after we leave the European Union. And I think it's worth noting that since the vote, there have been 3 big policy decisions where people might have thought outside or on the way out, the UK might have chosen Uncle Sam. over Uncle Jean-Claude. And in all three cases, we've lined up very solidly on the European side of the Atlantic. So with
those being
climate change, I think, Iran, and the location of embassies to the state of Israel.
Right.
It's funny how passions go through the Foreign Office and foreign policy. John Kerr, who's just left, remember talking about the time after the Berlin Wall came down and how diplomats felt really excited. He wasn't in a triumphalist way, but of just really feeling that they were standing for something about British values, European values, that was on the upswing, if you like. And I remember early in the Iraq days being on a plane to Iraq and Iran before it all started to go wrong. And the diplomats there really excited in a way you could now mock in retrospect, but say, look, we're there to do something. I asked at the time what had happened to all their colleagues in neat suits on the Eurostar going off to Brussels, and they thought, okay, that was all much less exciting than being with a flak jacket on the planes to Baghdad. But these things come, they come with a lot of commitment, and even if, in retrospect, people feel more doubtful about some of them, we shouldn't write off the possibility that, new strain of conviction comes through. We're just in a bit of a rain shadow at the moment.
Yeah, and just a quick point on both of those. I think that, if I were a passionate Brexiter, I would be a bit worried that almost none of the senior civil servants charged with this, with the possible exception of Simon, believe in it. So that they are. I remember, meeting one of the team working on this and just sort of saying jokingly, are you enjoying your job? And he said, not really, no. I think there's not much of a kind of. It's difficult to believe that they can make the best job of it if they don't really believe in it. But they may be right on that. But on the values front, I think it's quite an interesting thing. Potentially, in a slightly dark way, an opportunity for Britain, because I actually think that there's a huge values division opening within the European Union. You can see it with Hungary, you can see it with Poland, you can now see it with Italy. I think in a couple of months you're going to have horrifying headlines all over Europe about deportations of migrants from Italy. That group of sort of populist far right, if I can use that term, emerging is growing. Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, actually, they had an election on yesterday where another of them came in. They are a bloc now in the EU, and I think that means that when the French and the Germans look around, they're actually going to see that Britain has more in common with them on these fundamental values questions than half the people around the European Council table. How that plays out, I don't quite know, but I think that potentially it's an opportunity for the UK to say, look, we may not be formally in the club, but we are closer to you on these very fundamental, in fact, arguably defining issues for our age. So perhaps it'd be a good idea to work with us.
Even if we're deporting foreigners ourselves while we say it. Even if we're deporting foreigners ourselves while we say it. Which is
sure, as they are, as the French are, as the Germans are, but I think there will be an extra roughness to the Salvini style, Orban style politics.
Just Simon, just on this, the beliefs of the civil service, does the tone now taken increasingly regularly either by politicians when they attack the civil service, or even by some of your former colleagues, it seems daily in the press, does that disturb you in any way? Does it worry you?
I believe in the civil service. I believe in the public service ethos in this country, and so I monitor this closely. The intervention of retired colleagues is sometimes a surprise, because I think the compact continues throughout our retirement, but that I understand is a personal view.
It's Chris Morris from the BBC. It's something Gideon's alluded to a little bit already, but I wonder if you could expand on it. We're talking about the Foreign Office after Brexit, but it strikes me that so much depends on whether what's happening in Washington at the moment is a 4 or perhaps 8-year spasm, if you can use that word, after which perhaps things revert to a little bit as they were before, or whether this is the beginning of a profoundly different American relationship with the rest of the world. Until we know that, it seems to me it's hard to know how you position the Foreign Office. And just a slightly different question for Simon. I'm just interested in how you would foresee things like the Foreign Affairs Council in the future, would the recommendation from the Foreign Office be, whenever the invitation is, do you want to have an observer in the room? Let's get in there, let's still be in there. If we don't have a vote anymore, we should be in the room observing? Or is it more, we need to step back because we're leaving and let them get on with it?
Can we just take one more from this side, and then we've got a final two over there, which we'll take afterwards and hopefully fit everyone in.
Yeah, hi, Trevor Kalis. I'm a former diplomat. It may be unfair to ask this of Simon, but given that Brexit has been so politicising and divisive, is it more difficult than it was before to speak truth to power when it comes to advising ministers on certain policies?
First on Chris and the Foreign Affairs Council. I mean, this is all actively being discussed now with the Article 50 task force in Brussels. And we are keen to maintain contact. And how we maintain contact, whether it's before meetings, in the margins of meetings, is something that we are actively discussing. But we expect them to be interested in us and us to be interested in them on all the full range of foreign policy issues, especially where we're acting together further in third countries, even after we leave. And talking truth to power, I think it's always been quite difficult, but I think the key always is done in private. You know, doing it via Twitter, it just makes the tweeter feel better, I think. But it is an essential part of our function, but I think can only be done in private. You know, there are reasons why civil servants are not public figures, and I think it protects our ability to perform that function.
Can I just take the last two questions, and you'll have a chance to round off? So, gentlemen sitting there, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ben Alexander. Going back to the original panel discussion, it felt to me like it was painting a picture. I understand the limitations that we don't know what's happening in Brexit, but painting a picture of a quite reactive foreign policy. But notwithstanding the limitations we've discussed about global Britain, I think it's possible to infer, and I think we heard behind me actually a political sort of desire for a more projectionist and proactive foreign policy after Brexit. Is that something that's sensible for Britain to aspire to? And if that's the case, can you think of any sort of areas of foreign policy where Britain is in a position or to actually establish a niche or provide a lead on the global field?
And finally, Matthew.
Thank you very much. Matthew Holhouse from MNext News Agency. So Simon, I wondered if I could ask you about one of the immediate challenges you're facing on Brexit, which is on sanctions. As I understand it, you've got around 1,000 files in the EU in force against various actors and people around the world that you need to get into UK law. Can I ask, how's that going, and why is that such a difficult task? What are the obstacles in converting those over?
Well, the sanctions bill is in the House. The sanctions provisions, I think, have been pretty much agreed, but it's a bill that also includes financial regulation, and that is proving much more challenging with the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. So that is where I think the main difficulty is. But as a technical bill to make sure that we can have continuity in sanctions regimes, I think it has been pretty good. I also note that a lot of the EU's sanctions capability is British lawyers. And so what the EU is going to do is also quite interesting as they look at 2019. Looking at our ambition, I mean, however we phrase it, we are not a power in the same way as the United States and China. So, looking at the world and deciding where we're going to throw our weight about, it doesn't seem to me a particularly productive way of looking at our future. But I think we can choose and we can have effect. And I note that Scandinavia is characterized by choosing subjects where they invest deep and they make a very big difference. So it is possible for countries which are not the United States and China to make a difference, a positive difference. And we are involved in nearly all the big dossiers. So when we're dealing as an international community with Libya or Yemen or Iran or the Middle East peace process or the Rohingya, the United Kingdom is there. We're not in everything anymore. It's quite interesting that Ukraine has been largely handled without the United Kingdom in the last several years. But we're there, and I think by placing our efforts, we can make a difference.
Last word to you two.
All right, let me take 2 quick points, one on Trump, one on the relations between ministers and civil service. On Trump, I would assume, I think he's got a very good chance of a second term, depending on lawsuits and so on. But even if he were to go and some of the trappings like Twitter and so on with him, White House by Twitter, to go with him, I would assume that the politics he stands for, remain. He says something about the United States. How much of the new normal that he's managed to create lasts, I don't know. For example, employing your own family, not releasing your tax returns, asserting that the law doesn't apply while you're president in terms of being charged or so on. But no, I'd assume. But you're asking about the foreign policy, and the bit that really is up for grabs, though, is just what we're discussing, of whether he has permanently changed America's trade policy in particular and its willingness to act abroad. And I would think, as I said, he stands for something that is quite popular. On the relations between ministers and civil servants, we hear a lot from both sides, obviously, here. And, the 2 groups of people immensely dedicated to public service who've gone into it, for that reason. It seems to me things are more strained perhaps than they were in the past, partly because of the pressure on politics itself. The parties not knowing how long they're there, ministers not knowing how long they'll be in the job, rushing in, trying to get their 3 priorities, but it may be 10 done. And in all this kind of atmosphere, it just puts extra pressure on a relationship and takes away some of that space, private space, to negotiate these things that Simon was talking about. But it's not a crisis, but the strain affects everyone involved in it.
Yeah, I just to pick up on Chris's point, I do think that the Trump election is changing the world so fast that it's redefining what Brexit means as we're going. And it was interesting that when the 2 events happened initially, they were very much grouped together, including by Trump. And people like I think Steve Bannon said the moment he knew they would win was when Britain voted for Brexit. But I think that as time has passed, thankfully, from a British point of view, it's become clear there are big distinctions, certainly in the way that these 2 populist revolts have been interpreted by, I suppose it's as if Nigel Farage were in number 10 rather than Theresa May. The populist is in charge in the United States, and it seems he's just getting into his stride. So in some sense, this debate about, I think we're slightly whistling in the dark when we say, well, maybe it'll only be 4 years, and he's only done a year and 3 months. He's done a lot already, and it seemed, and I think in the first year there was this sort of comforting sense that maybe the adults had taken over. McMaster was there, and so on. Tillerson seemed experienced. But now those guys have gone. You've got John Bolton as National Security Council advisor. You've got a Bannonite trade policy, even if Bannon himself is not there. And that, I think, fundamentally changes the context in which the Brexiters thought they were Brexiting into. The world they thought they were entering doesn't exist anymore. And it's changing very, very rapidly. And I think it could, this could just be the beginning. I mentioned the rise of the sort of populist far right in Europe. There are close connections between them and the Trump White House. We saw that just today with the American ambassador in Germany saying that he wanted to build ties with these guys. Steve Bannon was in Rome on the night of the Italian election and indeed has said that Viktor Orban is the most important figure in Europe. So, and his way of thinking is still there, even if he himself is gone. So I'd love to be able to say, and therefore, I don't think we can say that yet, but it means that the task of Brexit, which was monumental anyway, is now even harder to assume because the second anchor of British foreign policy has also slipped loose. So it becomes, very tricky. Nice job for Simon to have at the moment. Interesting times.
I'm afraid time has caught up with us. Before I end, let me just draw your attention to another event here at the Institute for Government on the 12th of July, when Matthew Rycroft is going to be here talking about development policy after Brexit. But now it just remains to thank Gideon, to thank Bronwyn, and particularly to thank Simon for taking part in what I thought was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you all.